Our final keynote speaker is René August. René is a veteran of the anti-apartheid movement. She is an Anglican priest and a reconciliation trainer with The Warehouse, a worshiping community organization in Cape Town, South Africa, that walks alongside churches as they seek to respond to the issues of poverty, injustice, and division in a city that struggles with some of the worst inequality in the world. Her work is about the unseen and the beauty in the undiscovered, harnessing her ability to see both the light and the darkness. René's keynote is on peacemaking to heal humans and landscapes caught in conflict.
I come to this conversation because of my faith that is about following the example of the great storyteller, Jesus. When I read over the pages of the Gospels, Jesus engaging with empire itself, over and over again, he asks questions and tells stories. These questions and stories disrupt notions of power, of identity, of belonging. Because in this life that we read about, we find that stories matter. Stories that we tell about the world, stories we tell about ourselves, stories we tell about one another. All these stories matter. Emmanuel Katongole, in his book, The Sacrifice of Africa, says all politics are about stories and imagination. Stories not only shape how we view reality, but also how we respond to life, and indeed, the very sort of persons we become. In other words, how we imagine ourselves creates not only the chaos that we live in, but the potential for hope and transformation. This idea that we can be anything we want to be, he says, is an insidious lie. We heard from Emmanuel about memory. The memories we can conceive of exist because of the stories we have been told and the stories we tell. Debbie Ford, in her book, The Dark Side of the Light Chasers, asks this question: what is the story that you believe about yourself that has created the world in which you now live? Stories create not only ecologies, but social constructs and even morality. Just a few examples. HP, Hewlett-Packard, you familiar with them? They had the company slogan was to, I'm paraphrasing, so don't kill me, to be the best technological company in the world. And then they changed one word to reframe their story, to become the best technological company for the world. Stories matter. For those of you who've enjoyed Hunger Games, any Hunger Games fans? Very few, I'm surprised, but I see some thumbs up. There's a line in Hunger Games that is repeated over and over again. May the odds be ever in your favor. For us to reshape ecosystems, there's only one letter that can transform that entire narrative. May the odds be ever in our favor. Stories matter. Stories create notions, even like the one that we hear of Africa. Stories about people and continents, ideas, conquest, even empire. In the same way, these stories are true when we think about peace and healing. The stories we tell shape what we think peace must look like, what people must do when they live in peace, what work is required of those who do peace building, what values they should hold, what aspirations and ideas they need to have. Stories are very powerful. But how do we transform the stories that we live in? Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a mentor, once said to me, "Do you know what the problem is with the world?" Obviously, I leaned in. The problem is that we just don't know that we belong to one another. How about that for a story? We all belong. And so even this notion of belonging and our belonging is a story that needs our attention today. Because the story of belonging for me is a story that is the work of hospitality. Hospitality, this work of making room, of enlarging the story so that it can create the space for all to belong. The stories of hospitality requires our embodiment. And so while I was sitting here, I was looking up at the stained glass window. Do you see the words right at the bottom? Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Given our global context, the story we tell about ourselves and about the other will shape even the words of that prayer. What might a story sound like that creates the space for all to belong in that city? This work of making room and enlarging our stories is work that was done in my own country, South Africa. And one of our Prophet Peter's story used this particular line to invite us into this story of belonging. The pain of being together, he said, is better than the pain of being apart. The pain of being together is better than the pain of being apart. What might that have done as we listened to Claire in the Good Friday agreement, where sacrifices were made? The pain of being together is better than the pain of being apart. As we listen to the story of economies from Tequila, Kate Rayworth, for those of you who know her, an economist, talks about economies in which all can thrive, instead of an economy that requires growth. Do you see how that story transforms the entire ecosystem? And so these ecosystems, I want to suggest, are not only spiritual or matter, but these ecosystems are created because of where we put our bodies. Where we put our bodies creates habitats for all of creation to be nourished. And so what are the stories of hospitality that earth invites us into? Earth as our primary host, and our bodies as our secondary host. Earth is able to absorb and hold and create space. Earth is able to provide habitat. Earth nurtures. Earth gives. Earth holds. And in all of these acts of hospitality, we are invited to embody those stories in the places where we live. Seeking to find stories that disrupt the narratives of empire is part of our primary work. In an advocacy group in South Africa called Reclaim the City, they used a story to talk about property. With a simple line, property is for people, not for profits. Earth is for all, not for consumption. And as we tell these stories, they are not only stories that we tell so that we can believe them, but these stories invite us to give a GPS location for where we can read the telling of this story. And so what I'd like to suggest is in this work of peace building, we are invited to practice this spiritual economy. We don't yet know how to live in these stories, but our work is to learn how to practice. Brian McLaren, who wrote a book called We Make the Way by Walking, talks about this idea of our spiritual journey. He says, and I'm going to have to demonstrate. He says in our spiritual journey, we're walking along this way in community with others. And sometimes we get to a place where there is no more road. No one has gone this way before. And we don't know where to turn. The work of storytelling in this moment is to look back. To ask, where have we come from? So that we can learn the trajectory of where we need to go. And maybe even of where we should no longer go. And he talks about this work as faithful improvisation. And so what is the story that you now live in? What is the story that creates a large enough hospitality so that all can belong? I want you to think about that for a moment. What is the story that you want to tell of a world that is big enough room for all to belong? It might be in that story that no one has gone that way before. The invitation here is faithful improvisation. This is courageous work. Because to live in a story requires not only courage, but conviction that the story can one day be true. And so in the work that I do, in peace building, in being in conversations with people who are literally at war with one another. The invitation is always, what is the story that can hold us together in this moment? Some of you might know that there's been a lot of conflict in Zimbabwe. And so as an election was coming up, all the young activists were talking about what they're going to do to make sure that there is no more violence during elections. And their work was to construct a story of Zimbabwe that was big enough for all to feel like, yes, I can belong to that story. What is the story of Jerusalem that we can tell? That is big enough, hospitable enough to create room for all to belong. If we cannot imagine those stories, then that is where our work begins. But whatever story we tell is a story that not only creates reality, but creates the limitations in which we are able to live. And so Emmanuel spoke about seeds holding memory. I'm not wanting to mess with the mystics. But part of those memories are stories. What are the stories that you have been told? What are the stories that have shaped your family, your country, your politics? What are the stories that have shaped your relationships with money? You see, the work of empire is to ensure that certain stories remain true. This is the way it is, and this is the way it's going to stay. And without the work of reimagining a hospitable story, the ecologies required for all of us to thrive will be impossible. We tell children's stories before they go to bed. What are the stories that we want to tell ourselves about our role, our place, who we are and who they are? What are the stories that need to be disrupted? Those ones that have shaped our values. I told you earlier on, my ancestors were enslaved in the month of August. You see, people who were enslaved had a particular measurement attached to their identity. That was back of the time of the British Empire in South Africa, but remains true in the coffee plantations of Guatemala today. Your worth is dependent on how many coffee beans you can pick. Every basket you fill, you get $2. And so when our value is determined by what we are able to produce, we too are enslaved. What is a story about human value that is not related to production, but related to belonging? St Ethelburgers have invited us into a work of storytelling. It's listed in their values for dialogue. Respecting one another's views, even when you disagree. What is a story that belongs with that value? We don't live well, Eugene Peterson says, because we don't tell stories well. And so the invitation in this very, very grand topic, peacemaking to heal humans and landscapes caused in conflict. We are all caught in conflicting stories about ourselves and one another. The invitation today is firstly for us to take those stories seriously, to recognize that they have created things that we no longer want, but also to step into a new work of creating a much bigger story, one in which all can belong. And our courage then to live into that story. Thank you.
Oh, René, thank you so much for that beautiful reflection on stories and belonging and hospitality, of economies where all can thrive, of faithful improvisation and prophetic imagination. But we have a good amount of time. René was saying to me that this is intentional. She stopped a little bit earlier so that we could engage in story with one another. So if any of you do have a comment or a question, please do stand, and Nadine and Ahmed will come to you. It's right here in the pink.
Thank you, René, for your talk this afternoon. I feel so nurtured this afternoon. I come from South Africa. I was born and bred there. So, so I was talking to my friend here from Georgia in terms of stories and which story. And then I was saying this stories. And then in terms of, we were talking about earlier in terms of awakening, in terms of awareness. And for me, the work we're talking together as well about the work you are doing, peace building. You are doing a very difficult work. I mean, I appreciate what you're doing. We are very grateful to have people like you doing that work in South Africa with our history of colonization with the British, the Dutch. And when we mention these things, we are not making people to feel guilty. And Georgia was saying, how can I connect with you, Lungile, that's my name, and not feel guilty? I said, that's exactly what's going to stop Georgia connecting with me when she starts bringing that guilt. And then she just needs, because now it's going to be about the person who's feeling guilty, not about the connection and interconnectedness and us moving forward. So, and we were discussing that, and she was saying, Georgia here sitting next to me, where do we start? I said we start from a place of humanity. And in South Africa, we've got what is called Ubuntu. And then in terms of Umuntu, Ungumuntu Ngabantu, and we've got a lot of work to do. And then here we just need allies and people to move from the place of feeling guilty, of being defensive. We had also the truth, also starting from a place of being truthful. We had TRC in South Africa. And also in terms of stories, and which story do we want? We want a story that's going to start from being honest, being truthful, being coming without feeling guilty, because once you start feeling guilty, then I'll have to start now comforting the guilty person. You know, the work is too, I mean, earlier when I came, I was talking also with the lady sitting next to me, and we were talking about in terms of, it wasn't guilt, it was in terms of connecting as well, you know, where do we start? We start from a place of humanity, and then in terms of where do we go forward? So thank you very much for, you know, you really nurtured me, and then as you are saying, it's like doing the work, and everybody to do the work, because I was talking earlier that, or my colleague next to me, my friend as well, we were talking about, she was also saying, it shouldn't be us doing the work, because it's tiring of having to explain to people. And then I even made an example. It's like someone stepping on my toe and someone and saying, oh, no, 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 it wasn't painful. I said, no, it was painful, you know. So we really get tired of having to explain time and time again, how did it feel? I said, no, it's painful, you know. We are not making these things up. It is history. The colonizers need to acknowledge what they did in our countries in terms of resources. What's the word when you remove the tooth? Yeah, exactly. All the resources, and then they say we are poor. No, we're not poor. We've got the resources. They've just been stolen. So just leave some behind and then give back. That's all we're asking for. I'm sorry I took long to speak, but I just felt very emotional and nurtured at the same time. To tell, this is the story, talking about stories. René, it's your fault for saying which story.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you for your story. I mean, obviously there's a lot one could say. Stories can be weaponized, and we need to be aware of that. I think part of the work in South Africa, so I'm aware that I'm in a different country. When we have these conversations in South Africa, you know, people are like, oh, but, you know, white people are going to get a hiding again, and they don't want to be made to feel guilty. And I'm just like, that's your story. Like, your story isn't only that you are a benefactor of injustice. You have other stories about yourself. Can you tell those ones? Aren't you bigger than a product of colonialism? Can you be a product of goodness in the world? Can you be a product of generosity? Live into that story. There's an invitation. Because it is not fair for me now as a black South African to try and manage your emotions and try not to make you feel guilty when that's actually your business. You can't give me double work. And then you want me to educate you. Now you want free education without paying for school fees. No, man. We've had enough of that. You need to come up with your own stories. You see, the thing about stories, so I know we are in an interfaith space. I come at this as someone who is a disciple of Jesus. Jesus requires a critical consciousness of the stories that we believe. If we are not willing to do the work of critical consciousness, looking at these stories and ask, what have these produced in the world? What do I want to see in the world? And then find a story that is more faithful to that trajectory, then we are going to carry on having awkwardness. And I'm tired of that. That's my story. I'm tired of your awkwardness when you live in a story that isn't big enough for us to have a friendship and love one another. So we all have work to do, and the stories can help us do that work.
Thank you so much. Nadine, yes. If you could stand, please. Thank you.
Thank you, René. That was a beautiful keynote. I loved your reference to the term and the concept Sankofa, the importance of looking back to guide our way forwards. I think when it comes to the intersection of Sankofa and storytelling, I see this taking the form of myth, of the stories that have persevered through time and spaces that transcend those things and that are still with us today and still relevant to us all. And that, as Ursula K. Le Guin said, the purpose of myth is to tell us who we are. My question to you then is there a myth or a story or an idea from the past that you find particularly informs, shapes your hopes and your dreams for the future? In line with the concept of Sankofa.
I love that question, thank you. I don't know about in terms of Sankofa, but I would say that a story that roots me is a simple one. I have a choice. I always have a choice. And one of the choices is I don't have to be here. And the power of empire tries to steal that from us. And so for me, the looking back is, who are the people who have transcended the story that they were told by making a different choice? And so, in the midst of conflict, when people are literally shouting at one another or shouting at me because I'm the only person in the room that they feel allowed to be angry with, or when I remind them that they are at war with each other, I can remind myself I have a choice. I can say to them, this is your story and I am leaving. And so that helps.
Thank you. Yes. You could try to meet in the middle. Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, René, for your powerful, unbowed spirit. I believe in the power of story. What story do you have a sense of that we can tell to bring about the peace of Jerusalem?
Just in a casual
world peace,
7
right?
minutes. Yeah.
I think that the stories of Jerusalem belong firstly to the people who live there. And the stories that they will tell about themselves and that land will shape the future of that city. I would say for the peace of Jerusalem, everyone who lives there will need to believe that they are entitled to live in peace, no matter who they are and what they believe. And then we need to create a story that's big enough for that story to remain true in that space. And so I have no idea what that would look like. But if we come together believing in the peace, we exist for the peace of Jerusalem, you and I, and we hold different religious views. Every time we get stuck, we can go to the story that we believe brought us here. That we are here because we believe in, want to promote the peace of Jerusalem. And every step we take towards that, we find a new story. We also believe this or that. And so there's this woman, Chris Teng, who's a family therapist. She talks about the work of becoming multiversed compared to universe, having a single story. We must have more than one story we can tell about ourselves at any given moment. Yes, I'm South African, but I'm also a peace builder who works all around the world. And I'm also the youngest daughter of Mike and Jean. And I'm also a friend of Becca. And I do a whole bunch of other things, and I must be able to say, Becca, as your friend, I want to say this, but as a peace builder, I need to say this. So that both stories can remain true, and I can live in both of those stories, or multiple stories. I don't know if that's helpful. I saw someone standing.
Yes. Last question or comment. Thank you so much, Nadine.
So thank you very much. I just had a question around where the story is coming from. So we've had some really beautiful speeches today, people talking about very deep connections that we have, and also engaging our minds. So you have the mind and the heart. And when stories come from the heart, they have a very different quality to the ones that come from the mind. And I wondered if you had any reflections on how you do that in practice, how to help people to come into that heart space, and what happens if you do manage it.
We don't have time to explore the breadth of that question, but I think maybe simply to say the story of my heart needs to, I referred earlier on to a GPS location. There's the stories of our minds and our hearts and our imagination. There's the story of my faith. But at the end of the day, where will my feet be? If I believe in this particular story that will create the peace of Jerusalem, then it requires my feet to be located in a place. And so I think the conversation piece that's missing for me when we talk about the hard questions is, how do I live that story? Because that's the place that shows the conviction of how much I believe that story. It's one thing for me to tell you a story here, but if I'm not living it, then, I mean, that's the problem of pontification. People have great ideas, but if you can't do it, then we create a crisis. And so I would say, can your heart story relocate you in any way? Even a little bit, to move you from a me to a we. Just that increment. And I guess it's the moving away from the individual to the communal. But even if it's just 2 of us, who then become 4 of us, how does the story move you? From where you are now, closer to where that story has invited you to. Because if the stories don't move us, then the fiction is unhelpful for the work that we're trying to do in the world. So, yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, René. Please give René a warm round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.